People talk about public figures as if they're carved out of something solid, something predictable, something simple. But when it comes to Charlie Kirk, the story most people think they know isn't really a story at all. It's a projection, a brand, a polished surface built to look like certainty in a world that rarely gives anyone a straight line. And when you peel back the layers, you start seeing the gap between the image and the machinery behind it. The difference between what people are told he represents and what he actually does. Charlie presents himself as a defender of truth, someone standing firm against chaos, someone offering clarity to people who feel overwhelmed. And that's exactly why the narrative around him spreads so easily, because certainty, even when it's misplaced, feels like safety. But the moment you start asking basic questions, logical questions, the structure starts to wobble. You realize the message isn't designed for understanding, it's designed for allegiance. One of the first things that stands out is how often he appeals to fear while calling it courage. He'll say he's exposing lies, protecting values, upholding some higher order. But the emotional weight is always fear-based, fear of decline, fear of outsiders, fear of cultural decay, fear of questioning, and fear is the perfect tool if you want people to stop thinking and start reacting. It puts the brain into survival mode, and once someone feels threatened, they'll grab onto whatever voice promises certainty, even if that certainty is hollow. This is where the religious messaging enters the picture, not subtly, not as a personal belief he happens to hold, but as an all-purpose anchor to shut down complexity. He presents faith as if it's a shortcut to truth, a ready-made answer to any doubt. But when you listen closely, the arguments don't build on evidence or careful reasoning. They build on the assumption that questioning itself is dangerous. And once you convince people that doubt is a moral weakness, you've taken away the very tool they need to evaluate anything he says. The problem isn't that he believes what he believes. Everyone is allowed to. The problem is the way he treats belief as a substitute for facts. He'll take huge, complicated issues, social issues, scientific questions, historical claims, and reduce them to quick religious statements that have emotional punch but no real explanatory power. And instead of encouraging people to think for themselves, he frames thinking as a threat, as if curiosity is a slippery slope toward ruin. It's a clever tactic because the easier something feels, the more people trust it. There's a pattern you start to notice in his arguments. He rarely engages the strongest version of any idea he criticizes. He often picks the weakest examples, the fringe cases, and acts like they represent the mainstream. This tactic is effective because most people never go looking for the stronger, more nuanced version of the argument he's attacking. If all they hear are exaggerations, they assume that's the whole story. And once that distortion becomes normal, every discussion becomes a performance rather than an exchange of ideas. Another thing you see is how he uses statistics the way some people use props. He'll cite a number, say it with confidence, and move on before anyone has time to check it. But statistics without context aren't evidence, they're decoration. A number can point to the truth or distract from it, depending on who's holding it. And when you examine some of the claims he makes, you find selective framing, missing variables, and sources that collapse the moment you lean on them. But most people never lean on them because the presentation is designed to feel authoritative. What makes this so effective is that it doesn't require deception in the traditional sense. It only requires people to stop asking questions. If something is framed as obvious, people resist the discomfort of looking deeper, and Charlie's entire framework depends on that discomfort, on the idea that deeper thinking is unnecessary because the real truth is simple, pre-packaged, and has already been decided by forces he presents as infallible. But the world isn't simple. Human behavior, society, morality, none of it fits into the neat categories he pretends it does. And when you build your worldview on top of a rigid religious foundation, you end up ignoring everything that doesn't align with it. That's why he dismisses vast areas of science, oversimplifies social dynamics, downplays historical complexity, and frames modern change as inherently corrupt. If your starting point is that an ancient text has all the answers, everything new automatically becomes a problem. The sad thing is that many people listening to him aren't looking for dogma, they're looking for explanations. They want to understand why things feel uncertain, why institutions fail, why society changes so quickly. But instead of giving them tools to navigate those questions, he gives them narratives that look like explanations but actually limit understanding. It's the intellectual equivalent of giving someone a locked box and telling them it contains all the answers, then scolding them if they try to open it. And once that locked box becomes part of someone's identity, challenging it feels like an attack rather than an invitation to think. That's the power of tying beliefs to self-worth. Charlie does this constantly. He frames agreement with him as a sign of strength, bravery, and loyalty, while disagreement becomes weakness, confusion, or moral failure. When ideas turn into identity badges, critical thinking turns into a threat. And that's how people end up defending claims they've never examined, simply because examining them would feel like losing part of themselves. What makes this more concerning is how he positions himself as an authority on subjects he hasn't meaningfully studied. You'll hear him speak confidently on biology, psychology, constitutional law, anthropology, and philosophy as if each field is just another talking point. But real expertise comes from engaging with the best available knowledge, not from repeating conclusions that already fit your worldview. And when you ignore the complexity of those fields, you end up presenting the world as a place where every problem has one cause and one solution, which simply isn't how reality works. Take his approach to scientific questions. He often dismisses decades of research because it conflicts with the story he wants to tell. But science doesn't care about stories. It cares about evidence, about replication, about models that predict the world better than the ones that came before. When you reject that process, not because the evidence is weak, but because you prefer a more comforting explanation, you've already stepped away from truth-seeking, and yet he frames that rejection as courage, as if ignoring evidence is an act of strength rather than an avoidance of complexity. You see the same pattern in his discussions about morality. He argues as if morality can only come from a divine source, as if humans are incapable of building ethical systems through reason, empathy, and shared experience. But human societies have created moral frameworks long before the traditions he promotes even existed. Cooperation, compassion, fairness. These aren't religious inventions. They're products of human evolution and social necessity. When he insists that morality must be externally imposed, he's not protecting morality. He's limiting it to a narrow interpretation that ignores what we've learned about human nature. He also tends to frame societal change as a threat. New ideas, new ways of living, new cultural trends. He casts them as dangers rather than developments. But societies have always changed. That change isn't a sign of decay, it's a sign of adaptation. When you treat every shift in culture as evidence of collapse, you turn natural social evolution into a source of fear, and fear makes people cling to the past even when the past wasn't working. Instead of asking what a better future could look like, they focus on protecting an idealized version of history that never truly existed. This is where the conversation about honesty becomes important. People assume that if someone speaks confidently, they must be telling the truth. But confidence isn't evidence, and conviction isn't accuracy. Charlie uses certainty the way a magician uses misdirection. If you say something loudly enough and often enough, you can make it feel true even when the foundations are shaky. And the more emotionally charged the topic, the easier it becomes. People don't fact-check. When they're scared or outraged, they cling to whatever voice promises to make the fear go away. This kind of messaging thrives on controversy. The more extreme the claim, the more attention it gets. Charlie understands this. He leans into conflict because conflict keeps the audience engaged. But that engagement comes at a cost. Instead of encouraging thoughtful discussion, it encourages team mentality. Us versus them, truth versus lies, good versus evil. And the moment a discussion turns into a battle, the goal stops being understanding and becomes victory. That's how complex issues get reduced to slogans, and how slogans become substitutes for thought. Look closely at the way he talks about opponents. The language is rarely about ideas. It's about character. He doesn't challenge arguments. He challenges intentions. He paints anyone who disagrees with him as dangerous, dishonest, or corrupted. That tactic works because it shifts the conversation away from facts and towards suspicion. When someone believes the other side is morally compromised, they stop listening. And when you stop listening, you stop learning. Another thing people overlook is how well this kind of messaging rewards oversimplification. A complex world is difficult to navigate, but a world divided into clear heroes and villains feels easier, even if it's wrong. Charlie's narratives offer that simplicity, a universe where every problem is caused by a small list of enemies and solved by a small list of beliefs. But real solutions require nuance. They require understanding root causes, not just finding targets. When you replace deep analysis with easy answers, you end up treating symptoms instead of causes, and blaming people instead of understanding systems. This is how his influence grows, not through depth, but through clarity. Clarity that comes from cutting away complexity rather than exploring it. And people gravitate toward that clarity because uncertainty is uncomfortable. But comfort isn't the same as truth. If anything, the truth usually expands uncertainty before it resolves it. That's the nature of honest inquiry. You learn something, it opens 10 new questions, and you keep going. But when someone tells you the questions themselves are wrong, they're not guiding you toward truth. They're guiding you toward conformity. And this is where the larger problem emerges, because once conformity conformity becomes a virtue, independent thinking becomes a vice. Charlie frames independence as rebellion, and rebellion as destabilizing, and destabilization as morally suspect. It's a chain reaction designed to make the act of thinking feel risky. And when people internalize that risk, they start policing their own thoughts. They avoid questions that might lead them outside the approved narrative. They self-censor, not because they're convinced, but because they're afraid of the implications of not being convinced. You see this most clearly when he talks about religion. He treats doubt as if it's a personal failure instead of a natural part of learning. But doubt is not only healthy, it's necessary. Without doubt, there's no refinement of ideas, no progress, no growth. Every meaningful discovery in human history began with someone doubting what they'd been told. Yet he portrays doubt as corrosion, as if questioning inherited beliefs somehow weakens society. That framing doesn't protect truth, it protects dogma. A big part of his appeal comes from how he packages complex emotional needs into simple ideological answers. People want belonging. He offers identity. People want purpose. He offers mission. People want stability. He offers certainty. But these are emotional experiences, not logical conclusions. And when someone ties their sense of purpose to an ideology, they become loyal to the ideology even when it starts conflicting with reality. That's how belief systems gain power, not through evidence, but through emotional dependence. One of the most concerning patterns is how he uses selective outrage. He highlights the failures of systems he opposes while ignoring or excusing the failures of systems he supports. This creates a distorted picture where his side always looks principled and the other side always looks corrupt. But real-world issues don't fall neatly along ideological lines. Problems are complex, structural, and often shared across groups. If you only point out flaws when they serve your agenda, you're not pursuing truth. You're performing loyalty. And that's the core of what makes his public persona misleading. It's not simply that his arguments are weak or that his evidence is thin. It's that the purpose of his rhetoric isn't understanding, it's allegiance. He isn't building a worldview that can withstand scrutiny. He's building a worldview that collapses if you scrutinize it. That's why he discourages critical thinking, elevates certainty over accuracy, and frames disagreement as moral decay. If your message depends on people not asking questions, you have every incentive to make questioning feel dangerous. You can see this dynamic in how he approaches education. He often claims that schools are indoctrination machines, but his solution isn't to teach students how to think, it's to teach them what to think. He rarely promotes critical thinking skills. Instead, he promotes ideological frameworks that align with his own beliefs. This isn't a push for better education, it's a push for controlled education. And controlled education is just indoctrination with different branding. What's ironic is that he uses the language of freedom to advocate for systems that reduce intellectual freedom. He talks about open debate, but shuts down questions that challenge his foundational assumptions. He talks about truth, but relies on narratives built from selective evidence. He talks about liberty, but treats dissent as a threat. When someone positions themselves as a defender of freedom while restricting the tools people need to be free, tools like critical thinking, curiosity, and skepticism, you have to question their intentions. Another layer of this conversation is the way he leverages identity politics while claiming to oppose identity politics. He talks about traditional values as if they belong to a single cultural lineage, and as if that lineage is the default for everyone. This framing creates in-groups and out-groups, but under the guise of promoting unity. If unity requires everyone to conform to one cultural identity, that's not unity, that's assimilation. And assimilation has nothing to do with truth, it has everything to do with power. He also tends to romanticize history. He talks about earlier eras as if they were morally pure, stable, and guided by some higher wisdom. But history is messy. Past societies struggled with violence, injustice, inequality, and superstition. They weren't golden ages, they were human ages. When you mythologize the past, you create unrealistic expectations for the present. And when the present fails to live up to those myths, people become bitter, fearful, and easier to manipulate. This nostalgic storytelling does something dangerous. It convinces people that progress is decline, that improvements in knowledge, rights, and social norms are actually signs of collapse. But progress is not chaos. It only feels like chaos if your worldview depends on static rules. If you expect society to remain frozen in time, anything new will feel threatening. Charlie capitalizes on that feeling, using it to frame necessary change as existential danger. That's how you get people to reject ideas that would benefit them simply because those ideas don't align with an older narrative. Look at how he talks about social issues. He rarely examines the underlying causes, economic, psychological, historical. Instead, he frames problems as moral failings. If someone is struggling, it's because they lost their values. If society is changing, It's because people abandon tradition. This kind of moral reductionism prevents real solutions. If you think every issue stems from moral decline, you'll never look at the systems that create inequality, instability, or injustice. And if you never look at the systems, the problems remain unsolved. This brings us to a deeper point. Charlie's worldview depends on the illusion of fragility. He portrays society as something that could collapse at any moment if people don't strictly adhere to certain beliefs. But societies don't collapse because people ask questions. They collapse when people stop adapting. They collapse when outdated systems refuse to evolve. They collapse when leaders cling to dogma instead of evidence. Encouraging curiosity doesn't weaken a civilization. It strengthens it. Discouraging curiosity weakens it, and that's why voices that discourage questioning always present themselves as protectors. Protection sounds noble, it sounds reassuring, but protection can also be a way of keeping people dependent, keeping them small, keeping them aligned with someone else's sense of order. When someone positions themselves as a shield against confusion, they're often just a barrier between you and understanding. Confusion is temporary, curiosity resolves it. But if you're told that curiosity is dangerous, the confusion becomes permanent, and the person offering protection becomes indispensable. You can see this dynamic in how Charlie frames disagreement. He doesn't treat opposing views as different ways of interpreting evidence. He treats them as threats to the very fabric of society. When disagreement becomes existential, dialogue becomes impossible. And when dialogue is impossible, whoever claims to be the voice of stability becomes the default authority. That's how power is maintained, not through reasoned persuasion, but through fear of alternatives. There's also the issue of certainty. Charlie rarely presents ideas with humility. There's never room for "I might be wrong" or "let's examine this further." Instead, the tone is absolute. Certainty has a psychological appeal. It makes people feel anchored. But intellectual honesty requires openness. The willingness to adjust your views when the evidence changes isn't weakness, it's strength. And when someone builds an entire brand on unwavering certainty, they stop engaging with reality and start engaging with performance. This is why so many of his arguments feel memorized rather than reasoned. They're rehearsed lines meant to trigger familiar emotional responses: pride, fear, outrage, nostalgia. These emotions are powerful, but they're not arguments, they're tools. And when you rely on emotional tools instead of evidence, you can make almost anything sound persuasive. But persuasion without substance is just manipulation with better lighting. It's important to understand the psychological appeal of his message. People are drawn to strong voices when they feel uncertain. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. Economic instability, social change, technological disruption, political polarization. These pressures make people crave simple explanations. They want something that feels solid. Charlie offers that solidity not by clarifying complexity, but by denying it. He turns ambiguity into certainty, uncertainty into threat, and complexity into moral failure. But denying complexity doesn't make it disappear. It just pushes people into frameworks that can't actually explain the world they're living in. That's why you'll see many of his followers feeling angry or confused when reality contradicts the narratives they've internalized. The world becomes hostile because the narrative is too narrow to make sense of it. And instead of expanding the narrative, he tells them the world is broken. That approach doesn't offer understanding. It offers scapegoats. One of the things that rarely gets discussed is the economic side of his influence. Outrage is profitable. Certainty is marketable. Ideological simplicity sells better than nuance. And when someone's livelihood depends on the continuation of conflict, they have no incentive to resolve it. They need the tension, they need the divisions, they need the sense of crisis. When your business model relies on people believing the world is falling apart, you're not going to encourage rational, calm examination of issues, even if that examination would help people understand things better. This is where intention matters. Is he actually trying to help people think more clearly, or is he giving them a brand identity to adopt? When you listen carefully, it's clear that what he offers isn't clarity. It's a ready-made worldview, something you can wear, something that signals belonging. But the cost of adopting a worldview without understanding it is that you become dependent on the person who provided it, and dependence is the soil where dogma grows. You also notice how he uses religious claims as if they're self-evident truths rather than positions that require justification. He presents them as if they're objective facts, immune to scrutiny. But presenting beliefs as facts doesn't make them facts. It just turns conversation into proclamation. And proclamation is the opposite of inquiry. Inquiry acknowledges uncertainty. Proclamation replaces it with authority. Authority isn't inherently bad, but when it's built on unverifiable claims, it becomes a barrier to intellectual honesty. One of the most consistent features of his rhetoric is the assumption that moral truth must be external, delivered from above rather than discovered from within human experience. But human beings aren't moral because they're following commands. They're moral because empathy, cooperation, and fairness have helped our species survive. These traits are independent of any religious doctrine. They arise from our nature as social beings. When morality is framed as something imposed rather than developed, it becomes rigid and fragile. And fragile morality can't handle real-world complexity. Take his comments on personal responsibility. He often treats responsibility as an isolated concept, as if individuals exist outside of systems, histories, and conditions. But responsibility is shaped by context. Without understanding someone's circumstances, you can't meaningfully talk about their choices. When you ignore that context, you end up blaming individuals for systemic problems and praising systems that create unnecessary suffering. This kind of thinking doesn't lead to solutions. It leads to resentment. What makes his message particularly potent is the way it merges identity, morality, and worldview into a single package. That package is easy to adopt because it requires no exploration. Everything comes pre-labeled: who is good, who is bad, what is true, what is false, what is sacred, what is dangerous. But the moment you adopt that package, you stop seeing the world as it is and start seeing it as he describes it. And once someone becomes your lens for reality, you're no longer engaging with reality directly. This has consequences. When people lose confidence in their own ability to think, they become more susceptible to emotional narratives. They start treating discomfort as evidence that they're wrong, rather than evidence that they're learning. They stop asking questions not because they've found answers, but because they've been trained to see questions as a threat to identity. And a person who stops questioning becomes predictable, which makes them easier to mobilize. And once people become easier to mobilize, the focus shifts. It's no longer about truth or understanding or growth. It becomes about maintaining the movement, maintaining the identity, maintaining the emotional momentum that keeps people aligned. This is why you'll notice that so much of Charlie's content isn't about explaining issues. It's about reinforcing feelings: outrage, pride, fear, righteousness. These emotions create energy, and that energy becomes the fuel for the message. But emotion without analysis can push people toward decisions that don't actually serve their interests. You can hear this when he talks about policies. The descriptions are rarely careful or detailed. They're framed as moral choices rather than practical ones. Something is good or evil, not effective or ineffective. But when moral language replaces analytical language, people stop asking the most important questions. Does this work? What are the consequences? Who benefits? Who suffers? These are the questions that lead to understanding. And understanding is the one thing that can weaken the emotional hold of ideology. Another element that often gets overlooked is how he uses community to strengthen belief. When people feel isolated, they're more likely to cling to a group that offers belonging. He taps into that through events, social media networks, and shared identity markers. The group becomes a buffer against uncertainty. But if the group is structured around shared belief rather than shared inquiry, individuals lose the freedom to explore beyond its boundaries. The cost of belonging becomes silence, or self-censorship, or the shrinking of one's intellectual world. And when someone's intellectual world shrinks, their emotional reliance on certainty expands. This makes the narratives he promotes even more compelling. It's a cycle. The smaller the worldview, the larger the fear of anything outside it. And the larger the fear, the tighter people cling to whoever promises safety. This is how dogma replaces dialogue, how certainty replaces curiosity, how authority replaces autonomy. One of the red flags in his rhetoric is the repeated insistence that he's simply telling it like it is. That phrase is almost always used by people who want to present their opinions as facts. When someone claims they're just being honest, it often means they want their worldview to go unchallenged. But honesty isn't about bluntness. Honesty is about accuracy. It's about acknowledging uncertainty. It's about grounding your claims in evidence, not emotion. And when someone frames their version of reality as the only acceptable one, that's not honesty. That's absolutism wrapped in casual language. You can see the consequences of this absolutism in how he treats disagreement. When someone disagrees with him, it's not interpreted as a difference in perspective or reasoning. It becomes evidence of corruption, confusion, or ideological possession. This framing creates an environment where disagreement can't be taken seriously. And when disagreement isn't taken seriously, no one learns, no one grows, and no one evolves. The conversation becomes a monologue disguised as a debate. There's also the matter of how he handles evidence. Instead of using evidence to form conclusions, he often uses conclusions to decide which evidence he's willing to accept. This is called motivated reasoning, and everyone is vulnerable to it. But when a public figure does it while claiming to be a truth teller, the result is intellectual distortion. You only see what fits your narrative. You only acknowledge what reinforces your worldview. Everything else gets ignored, minimized, or attacked. This approach isn't just intellectually dishonest, it's socially harmful. Because when millions of people adopt a worldview built on selective evidence, society loses its ability to reason collectively. Problems that require cooperation become battlegrounds. Issues that need careful study become ideological weapons. Instead of working toward solutions, people fight over simplified narratives. And the louder those narratives get, the harder it becomes to address the real, underlying challenges. You also notice how he frames himself as a defender of truth against powerful forces. But this framing only works if people believe they're under siege, culturally, morally, or spiritually. The idea that there is a hidden enemy planning to destroy society makes people hyper-vigilant and emotionally reactive. It turns every disagreement into a battle, every change into a threat, every new idea into an attack. This worldview doesn't help people navigate reality. It traps them in a state of perpetual alarm. Perpetual alarm is powerful. It keeps people from reflecting. It keeps them from examining claims. It keeps them from thinking deeply. And when people stop thinking deeply, they become easy to sway with emotional cues. This is how simplistic narratives maintain their influence, even when the evidence contradicts them. Fear doesn't need facts. Fear only needs direction, and Charlie is very skilled at giving fear a direction. Another tactic he uses is rhetorical speed. He speaks quickly, jumps topics, and overloads his audience with claims and talking points. This creates a situation where the viewer doesn't have time to evaluate anything. It feels like a logical flood, but it's actually just volume masquerading as argument. When someone talks fast enough, confidently enough, and aggressively enough, it can create the illusion of expertise. But expertise requires depth, and depth requires slowing down, exploring nuance, and acknowledging uncertainty. One of the most telling aspects of his rhetoric is how rarely he acknowledges personal fallibility. He rarely says, "I don't know," or "I was wrong." But the ability to admit uncertainty or error is essential for intellectual honesty. Without it, you're not seeking truth. You're maintaining a persona, and maintaining a persona means defending it at all costs, even against contradictory evidence. When someone can never be wrong, they can never learn. And when they can never learn, the only thing they can do is repeat what they already believe, louder each time. This repetition creates a feedback loop. His followers repeat the talking points. He amplifies their responses. And the cycle continues, giving the illusion of consensus where none actually exists. But consensus based on repetition isn't truth. It's echo, and echoes grow louder the more people stop thinking for themselves. And echoes don't challenge anyone. They don't adapt. They don't evolve, and they don't withstand scrutiny. They simply repeat until repetition feels like truth. That's the danger of ideological environments built on certainty rather than inquiry. They become closed systems, and closed systems aren't just resistant to new information. They're hostile to it. Anything unfamiliar becomes suspicious. Anything nuanced becomes manipulative. Anything complex becomes a threat. And when complexity becomes a threat, curiosity becomes collateral damage. This hostility toward complexity shows up clearly in how Charlie talks about human behavior. He reduces it to simple moral binaries, strong or weak, righteous or corrupt, faithful or lost. But people are more complicated than that. Human behavior is influenced by biology, culture, environment, trauma, opportunity, and countless variables that don't fit into neat ideological categories. When you ignore those variables and instead blame individuals for everything, you turn society into a morality play instead of a reality to be understood. He often talks about personal responsibility, as if it exists in a vacuum. But responsibility has context. It's shaped by the conditions people are born into, the resources available to them, and the systems they navigate. When you pretend that success or failure is purely a moral test, you end up judging people unfairly and misdiagnosing problems. And misdiagnosed problems can't be solved. They just get moralized, politicized, and weaponized. Weaponized morality is one of the most dangerous aspects of his message. Once morality becomes a weapon, it's no longer about improving society. It's about dividing it. You create categories of good people and bad people, not based on behavior, but based on allegiance. You turn ordinary disagreements into character judgments. And when character becomes the battlefield, actual solutions get lost in the noise. People stop listening to each other because listening feels like betrayal, and betrayal feels like danger. This is how polarization deepens, not through disagreement, but through moral absolutism. Another pattern is his frequent use of anecdotal evidence. He'll take one isolated example and present it as proof of a widespread trend. Anecdotes are emotionally powerful, but they're not data. They can point to something worth investigating, but they can't stand in for systematic evidence. When someone relies heavily on anecdotes while ignoring broader data, it means they're prioritizing emotional impact over accuracy. And emotional impact is easy to manufacture. Accuracy is harder. He also tends to interpret correlations as causations, especially when it supports his worldview. But correlations need context. Without context, they're meaningless. You can find patterns everywhere if you're not careful, especially in social data. But those patterns don't explain anything by themselves. They just reflect conditions that require deeper analysis. And deeper analysis is exactly what his worldview discourages, because deeper analysis reveals complexity, and complexity challenges dogma. Another issue is how he frames social progress. He talks about shifts in culture, policy, and norms as if they're symptoms of moral decline rather than responses to new information or greater understanding. When society becomes more inclusive, it's not because traditional values are collapsing. It's because we've learned more about human well-being, psychology, and rights. When he frames progress as chaos, he encourages people to view compassion as corruption and knowledge as danger. But progress only looks frightening if your worldview depends on everything staying still. He also has a habit of portraying his movement as the last line of defense. This framing creates urgency and fear, the idea that without obedience to his worldview, everything will collapse. But society is not on the brink of collapse every time beliefs are questioned. In fact, questioning beliefs is how societies grow stronger. Fear-based rhetoric makes people think stability is fragile, but real stability comes from resilience, adaptability, and honest evaluation of evidence, not from clinging to old narratives out of fear. Look at how he handles disagreement during interviews or Q&A sessions. When someone presents a thoughtful, well-reasoned argument, he often responds by shifting the topic, reframing the question, or attacking the premise. This tactic avoids engagement and instead maintains the illusion of victory. But dodging isn't winning, it's theater. And when public discourse becomes theater, the audience walks away thinking they've seen a debate, when in reality they've only seen a performance designed to reaffirm their existing beliefs. This reliance on performance over substance also shows up in the way he constructs his public persona. He presents himself as someone who has all the answers, someone who stands firm in the face of corruption and confusion. But no one has all the answers, and anyone who pretends to is more interested in influence than truth. The most honest thinkers throughout history have been the ones who acknowledged uncertainty, revised their views, and engage sincerely with opposing arguments. Certainty without humility isn't enlightenment, it's branding. Branding is a key element of his influence. The aesthetics, the tone, the talking points, they're all part of a package, and that package gives people a sense of identity. But identity built on ideology can be fragile. When someone ties their sense of self to a set of beliefs, any challenge to those beliefs becomes a challenge to their identity. This creates a defensive posture that makes learning nearly impossible. When your identity is at stake, you don't examine evidence. You protect your worldview at any cost. This is why people who follow voices like Charlie's often become more extreme over time. Not because the arguments get stronger, but because the emotional investment gets deeper. The more invested someone becomes, the harder it is to walk away. Admitting that the worldview is flawed feels like admitting personal failure. And when an ideology makes people feel morally superior, any doubt becomes a threat to that moral status. So people double down, even when presented with contradicting evidence. What makes this particularly troubling is how he positions questioning as dangerous while positioning obedience as virtuous. But unquestioned obedience has never led to societal improvement. Every major advancement in human knowledge, scientific, moral, political, came from someone who questioned the status quo. When you teach people to obey instead of examine, you're not protecting truth. You're suppressing the mechanisms that produce truth. And the irony is that the more we're told someone has all the answers, the more we should pay attention to the questions they never seem eager to address. Because those quiet areas, the parts they skip over, often reveal more about a worldview than the loudest speeches ever do. And with Charlie Kirk, those quiet areas are everywhere. They show up when science gets too detailed, when history stops matching simple slogans, when human behavior refuses to fit inside moral boxes drawn decades ago, and when the world looks nothing like the tidy picture painted in the talking points he's built his identity around. He isn't unique in that. Many public figures fall into the same trap, but he's become a loud example of how certainty can be manufactured and sold, even when the issues themselves are complex, nuanced, or unsettled. The trick is always to reduce everything to teams. One side enlightened, the other side misguided. But reality doesn't operate on teams. Reality doesn't care about the narratives people cling to. And the more we analyze the actual structure of his claims, the foundation underneath them, the harder it becomes to ignore the cracks he never acknowledges. One of the biggest cracks is the selective way he approaches evidence. If a study supports a view he already holds, it becomes unshakable proof. If a study challenges that view, suddenly the methodology is flawed, the researchers are biased, or the elites are manipulating the results. This is the classic pattern of motivated reasoning. It's not about discovering what's true, it's about defending what's already been chosen as truth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It shows up in his commentary on public health, on education, on morality, on nearly every topic he touches. Another thing that becomes clear is how frequently he frames disagreement as threat, not because the arguments against him are dangerous, but because admitting uncertainty would dismantle the image he presents. Uncertainty is actually healthy. It means you're thinking. But for someone whose influence depends on appearing absolutely confident, uncertainty becomes an enemy. So every challenge from science, every new discovery about human psychology, every shift in social understanding, all of it gets painted as an attack rather than as part of the natural process of learning. This mindset leads to a strange outcome. The world must always be framed as declining, even when measurable improvements are everywhere. Life expectancy improving in multiple regions, violent crime dropping over long timelines, technological progress revolutionizing access to knowledge, social inequality slowly shrinking across generations. These aren't small things, they are objective markers of progress. But the narrative of decline is emotionally useful, so it gets repeated even when the data points the other way. When people feel the world is falling apart, they become more receptive to simple explanations, more drawn to strong voices, more willing to trade nuance for certainty. And this is exactly the climate in which figures like Charlie Kirk thrive, not because their ideas are the strongest, but because their certainty feels comforting, even if the comfort isn't built on anything solid. But here's the interesting part. Once you step outside that emotional framing, once you examine the claims piece by piece, the entire structure begins to look different. Suddenly, the world isn't a battlefield between the righteous and the misguided. It's simply a place where humans are learning, adapting, experimenting with moral frameworks, trying to understand themselves, and slowly, sometimes painfully, improving the systems they live in. This shift in perspective is powerful. It turns the noise of culture wars into something far less intimidating. It turns absolute moral claims into starting points for discussion, not final answers. And it exposes how often Charlie Kirk's arguments rely on a kind of oversimplification that collapses under scrutiny. Take his discussions about values and meaning. He frequently insists that meaning must come from a single external authority, that human beings can't construct ethical frameworks on their own. But history doesn't support that. Anthropology doesn't support that. Psychology doesn't support that. The evolution of human cooperation, empathy, and social behavior clearly shows that moral structures emerge naturally in groups long before formal doctrines appear. People don't develop empathy because they're instructed to. Empathy exists because it helped our species survive. This understanding doesn't diminish moral significance, it deepens it. It shows that morality isn't fragile. It isn't something that disappears if you question a particular belief system. It's something that has been refined, expanded, and improved over thousands of years of human experience. And when someone insists that morality must remain frozen at one point in history, it reveals more about their fear of change than about the nature of morality itself. Kirk often presents modern ethical shifts, especially around personal freedom, identity, and societal norm, as if they're proof that people are becoming confused or lost. But this interpretation only makes sense if you assume that moral progress should look like a straight line. In reality, progress is messy. It involves debate, mistakes, corrections, new insights, and a willingness to challenge previously unquestioned assumptions. The messiness isn't a sign of collapse, it's a sign of growth. And growth is something that requires openness. It requires the humility to recognize that we don't know everything, that we can always learn more. This is where his worldview struggles the most. It leaves no space for the possibility that society can evolve moral understandings through collective reasoning rather than through rigid authority. It treats every deviation from tradition as surrender, every expression of new thinking as rebellion, every question as a threat. But the process of questioning is how societies become stronger. Every major improvement in human rights, human well-being, and human understanding began with someone asking a question that made others uncomfortable. The alternative, refusing to question anything, leads to stagnation. It creates a world where old ideas are preserved, not because they're true or useful, but because people are afraid of what comes next. Kirk's messaging often encourages exactly that kind of hesitation, not through explicit prohibitions, but through constant framing that equates change with danger. This is why so many of his arguments lean heavily on fear: fear of societal decline, fear of moral collapse, fear of losing identity, fear of the unknown. Fear is persuasive. It shuts down critical thinking. It narrows perspective. It makes simple explanations feel more believable than complex ones. But once fear is removed from the conversation, everything becomes clearer. And when you take a step back from the fear-driven framing, you start to notice how many of Charlie Kirk's claims depend on the assumption that people can't be trusted to think for themselves, that without a strict external authority, society will somehow unravel. But human history shows the opposite. When people are encouraged to think critically, to analyze evidence, to question assumptions, to test ideas, societies grow more stable, not less. Progress doesn't come from shutting down inquiry, it comes from allowing inquiry to reshape outdated ideas. This is the part he never addresses directly. He talks a lot about discipline and virtue, but rarely about the systems that actually strengthen a society. Education that encourages curiosity, scientific literacy that keeps people grounded in reality, and public dialogue that values evidence over emotion. These are the forces that create resilient communities, yet they don't fit neatly into his narrative because they empower individuals rather than centralizing authority. And another thing becomes clear: the more you analyze his worldview, it relies heavily on nostalgia. Not nostalgia for a specific decade, but for an imagined past, where everything was supposedly simpler, clearer, and morally aligned. This imagined past shows up in a lot of political rhetoric, but it falls apart under historical scrutiny. Life was not simpler, it was restricted, it wasn't clearer, it was constrained by limited information, limited mobility, and limited options. People weren't more unified, they were often silent, pressured, or excluded. Yet nostalgia paints those conditions as harmony. Once you recognize this pattern, it becomes easier to understand why his arguments feel disconnected from actual data. They're built around a story where the present is chaotic and the past was stable. But stability is often a reflection of who held power, not of how just or functional a society was. When more people gain visibility, rights, and the ability to challenge norms, society doesn't become less stable. It becomes more honest. The noise isn't the collapse of order, it's the sound of people being heard. And this is where his style becomes especially revealing. When presented with evidence that contradicts his narrative, he pivots to emotional arguments. He appeals to feelings of loss, confusion, or cultural displacement. These emotions are real. People do feel uncertain during times of change, but emotions alone can't serve as analysis. They can explain reactions, but they can't define truth. Yet he uses them as a kind of shield, avoiding the deeper questions that would force him to reconsider the foundations of his worldview. This approach is effective in the short term because emotional certainty is always easier to sell than intellectual humility. Certainty offers comfort. It tells people they don't have to wrestle with complexity or with the discomfort of revising long-held assumptions. But long-term, this approach leads to brittle thinking. It creates a worldview that can't adapt, can't self-correct, and can't integrate new information without experiencing it as a threat. And when a worldview becomes that rigid, it stops being a tool for understanding the world. Instead, it becomes a defensive mechanism. Everything that challenges it gets reframed as an attack, and everything that fits into it, even loosely, gets treated as confirmation. This isn't a path to clarity. It's a path to intellectual isolation. One of the most telling examples of this is the way Kirk talks about education. He frequently argues that universities are corrupt or misguided because they expose students to ideas that challenge traditional beliefs. But that's the entire purpose of education, to expand your thinking, not to reinforce the beliefs you walked in with. If learning never challenges you, you're not learning. You're just receiving validation. By framing exposure to diverse ideas as indoctrination, he flips reality upside down. True indoctrination is the refusal to let information in. It's the insistence that questioning is dangerous. It's the belief that exploring ideas outside a preset framework will somehow erode your identity. These are the conditions that limit a person's intellectual growth, not the act of hearing viewpoints that differ from their own. And the result is a worldview that encourages a kind of paradox. People are told they are strong, independent thinkers, while simultaneously being warned that exposure to certain ideas will corrupt them. It's impossible to reconcile those two claims. You can't argue that someone is capable of thinking for themselves and then suggest they should avoid information that might challenge their beliefs. But this contradiction persists because it serves a purpose. It keeps people aligned with a specific ideology while giving them the illusion of autonomy. It presents certainty as strength, even though real strength comes from being willing to test your assumptions, not hide from them. And this is why so many of his arguments feel fragile once you push past the surface. They depend on avoiding the very process that leads to deeper understanding. They rely on the idea that truth must be preserved, not discovered. That questioning is rebellion rather than refinement. That tradition is inherently wiser than collective learning. But when you remove the emotional framing and look at the world as it actually functions, a different picture emerges. Human knowledge has expanded because people dared to question. Societies improved because people challenged old norms. Technology advanced because people imagined solutions that tradition didn't provide. Medicine saved countless lives because researchers questioned assumptions that were once considered unshakable. Progress has never come from standing still, yet that is exactly what his worldview demands when it encounters change. And once you start to see how much of Charlie Kirk's worldview depends on holding the world still, the more you realize that the real issue isn't disagreement or even ideology. It's the refusal to accept that understanding can grow, that people can evolve, that progress isn't the enemy of meaning, but often the birthplace of it. Because meaning isn't something handed to us, it's something we build through experience, reflection, curiosity, and connection. And none of that requires locking ourselves inside the walls of someone else's certainty. There's something freeing about recognizing this. It takes away the pressure to pretend that one voice has everything figured out. It takes away the illusion that the world is supposed to fit a simple pattern. It makes room for complexity, for nuance, for new information, for perspectives that expand rather than restrict. And most importantly, it allows people to ask questions without feeling ashamed or afraid of where the answers might lead. And that's the part that often gets lost in the noise around figures like him. They frame questioning as rebellion, when in reality questioning is the most natural thing in the world. It's how children learn. It's how scientists advance. It's how societies adapt. It's how individuals grow into people who can think clearly and act responsibly. A worldview that discourages questions is a worldview that encourages stagnation, and stagnation never leads anywhere good. When you look closely at the claims he makes, the patterns he repeats, the assumptions he never examines, you start to see that the core isn't strength, it's fear of uncertainty. But uncertainty isn't a threat, it's a doorway. It's the space where learning happens. It's the space where new ideas are tested. It's the space where better solutions are found. And people are far more capable of navigating that space than he gives them credit for. The truth is that individuals are not as fragile as his rhetoric suggests. They don't collapse the moment they encounter a new perspective. They don't lose their moral compass just because the world around them evolves. They don't need to cling to rigid frameworks to live meaningful, responsible lives. What they need is honesty, evidence, open conversation, and space to think. These are the conditions that create strong communities. Not fear, not dogma, not the illusion that certainty is the same as truth. And once you embrace that way of seeing the world, grounded, evidence-focused, open to change, his arguments begin to look less like explanations and more like rehearsals, repeated lines designed to keep people anchored in the past instead of present reality. But the present is where life actually happens, where problems can be solved, where knowledge can be updated, where people can choose futures that aren't limited by outdated assumptions. In the end, the most revealing thing about Charlie Kirk isn't what he criticizes, it's what he avoids, the questions he sidesteps, the evidence he downplays, the complexity he refuses to acknowledge. Because complexity requires humility. Humility requires openness. And openness requires letting go of the illusion that one worldview has already captured every important truth. The world is bigger than that. People are bigger than that. And ideas are at their strongest when they can survive honest examination. So the next time you hear him speak with complete certainty about issues that experts spend their entire careers studying, pause, look at the assumptions underneath, look at the patterns in how he frames the world, look at the emotional cues designed to make things feel simpler than they are, and notice how many possibilities get cut away in the process. Because that's where the real story is, not in the loud declarations, but in the quiet places where critical thinking gets replaced with certainty. And once you see it, once you recognize how much of his worldview depends on avoiding the natural, necessary process of questioning, something shifts, the fear-based narrative loses its grip, the appeal of simplistic answers fades, and what's left is a clearer view of the world, one grounded in evidence, open reasoning, and the understanding that meaning isn't something to be defended from growth, it's something shaped by growth. And that's the part no one can take away, the ability to think freely, to evaluate claims without fear, to let evidence guide you instead of rhetoric, to build your own understanding of the world instead of inheriting someone else's. That freedom is what makes progress possible. It's what makes curiosity worth pursuing, and it's what exposes the limits of the rigid worldview he promotes. Because once your mind opens, even a little, the walls he relies on stop looking like protection and start looking like confinement. And stepping beyond those walls, even slightly, is often enough to see the world with more clarity than any pre-written script of certainty could ever offer.